As the evening of September 19, 1976 drew to a close and the dark hours of night approached, sitting on the ramp at Istanbul's Ataturk airport was Turkish Airlines Flight 452, a 727-200 series aircraft being prepared for its penultimate sector of what had already been a long day. Ahead was a relatively short domestic hop to the coastal city of Antalya, some 460 kilometres to the south. The aircraft in question had rolled off the Boeing production line a mere 2 years previously and was subsequently delivered to Turkish Airlines on the 1st of December 1974. Registered as Tango Charlie Juliet Bravo Hotel, the 727 had ironically been christened Antalya after the city, which was to be unknowingly its final destination. Having arrived earlier that evening from Rome at approximately 21:30 local, Turkish 452 with 68 passengers on board had been simply scheduled to transit through Ataturk while onwards to its final destination of Antalya. With most of those on board being Italian tourists, only 2 of the 68 inbound passengers disembarked at Istanbul, while at the same time an additional 81 joined, including a Turkish Airlines crew of 3 who were positioning to Antalya so as to operate back to Istanbul the following morning. Thus, the total passenger complement for the onward sector of 1 hour and 15 minutes was finalised at 147. This number was supplemented by a crew of 8, 2 pilots, a flight engineer, a ground engineer being carried to assist with the aircraft's turnaround at Antalya, and 4 cabin crew members. What nobody could have known was that just 35 minutes into the flight, 452 would meet its end, having impacted a hillside at Karaklipe, just south of the city of Isparta, at an altitude of 1,130 metres, that being just over 3,700 feet above sea level, in what could only be described as some of the most bizarre circumstances surrounding any high-profile aircraft accident. This is the story of those bizarre circumstances, and the events surrounding the loss of the 727 and all of those on board. Of the 8-strong crew complement, in command was Captain Jaylak Toktuoglu, assisted by First Officer Sajik Soangus and Flight Engineer Ahmed Bursali. With boarding and servicing complete, 452 finally closed doors and pushed from stand approximately 35 minutes behind schedule. Turkish 452 was again airborne from Istanbul at 22:45 local, giving it an expected arrival time into Antalya of midnight or thereabouts. Shortly after getting airborne, the 727 made the initial en route turn south and climbed into the clear night sky, leaving the lights of Istanbul behind it. Quite often when reporting on aircraft accidents and serious incidents, the environmental factors at the time are often cited as having played a significant role in influencing subsequent events. And indeed, such will be the case with Turkish 452, although not in the manner one would normally come to expect. On the night of September 19th, with the clear skies above, visibility along the intended route of flight was good, ironically too good. And so it was that this good weather, rather than bad, would influence the bizarre events which would shortly unfold. As the aircraft levelled off at its cruise flight level, in light of the short sector length, preparations were soon commenced for the descent and arrival into Antalya. Having briefed the intended approach with his first officer, and with the flight engineer occupied with his routine tasks of aircraft system management, Captain Toktuoglu seized the opportunity to leave the cockpit and take advantage of the forward toilet facilities in the cabin while he still could. At 23:11, now alone at the controls, First Officer Songus reported to air traffic control in Antalya that he had the airport lights in sight and that he wished to descend. Some 170 kilometres or 105 miles north of Antalya, and still some 20 to 25 minutes before what was anticipated to be their top of descent. What First Officer Songus was actually focused on were not the lights of the destination airport at all, but rather a lighted portion of highway leading into the city of Isparta, which coincidentally had the same geographic orientation as he was expecting to see of the runway environment at Antalya. Indeed, investigators subsequently believed that the first officer's misidentification of the highway for the runway lights at Antalya Airport was most probably reinforced by the featureless environment he would have observed south of the Isparta city lights. In his mind, Songus had reconciled this dark, featureless area to the south as being the wide open waters of the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, under the cover of darkness, what he was actually observing was the vista of the Taurus Mountains just beyond Isparta, which from his vantage point were masking the city lights of Antalya and the destination airport. In other words, from the right-hand seat of the 727's cockpit, Songus could see only one large urban area ahead of him, with only darkness beyond, and as such had convinced himself that he was seeing exactly what he had expected to see. Somewhat surprised by the first officer's comments, the controller at Antalya informed Songus that as of yet 452 had not appeared on his radar screen, and as such, not knowing exactly where the aircraft was, he wasn't in a position to issue a descent clearance as requested. In retrospect, this was to be a subtle clue to both those in the air and on the ground that things were not as Songus believed them to be. The most probable explanation as to why the controller could not establish radar contact with the aircraft was either because of the mountain range forming a physical obstacle between the two, or indeed the relative distance of the aircraft from the radar antenna was simply too great to establish a lock. Songus's response to the controller's confusion was somewhat abrupt and dismissive.
Sana mı inanmalıyım yoksa kendi gözlerime mi?
On foot of this, Evidence from the cockpit voice recorder recounted a conversation between the remaining crew members with regard the proposition of cancelling their IFR or instrument flight rule flight plan and continuing the remainder of the flight visually. Although a pilot flying on instruments is at liberty to cancel such a flight plan at any time and revert to flying purely by means of reference to outside visual cues, such action, particularly in the context of commercial airline operations, is extremely atypical and not encouraged. Indeed, such is the increased exposure risk that most jurisdictions prohibit such action during the hours of darkness, and with very good reason. Moonless nights, even with unrestricted visibility, can often result in complete mountain ranges simply blending into the environment around them, and being typically devoid of artificial lighting by way of streetlights, etc., can be all but invisible to the unsuspecting pilot. Alternatively, where the terrain is actually visible, other related issues such as distance and depth perception may still be dangerously compromised. Yet despite all this, and without the knowledge of his captain, who was still absent in the passenger cabin, Soungus apparently made the unilateral decision to press on and descend visually towards what he categorically believed was his intended destination. Had the controller been more forceful in his objections as to what Soungus was proposing, perhaps the situation may have ended differently, but one must be conscious of the aviation environment back in the late 70s. At the time, controllers were given very little latitude to interfere with the actions of a flight crew. Indeed, industry-wise, many were reluctant to question the decisions and actions of an airline crew, particularly in the Turkish context, where most pilots had come from highly influential military backgrounds, often with senior commissions. As such, Soungus, in the absence of any meaningful challenge, and believing totally in the strength of his own convictions, began to visually descend the 727 towards the visible lights ahead. In a story which offers up one surprise after the next, unbelievably Soungus managed to descend many thousands of feet before Captain Toktuolu re-entered the cockpit some 9 minutes later, at approximately 23:20, by which time the aircraft was only 490 feet above the terrain below and apparently fully committed to a landing on the highway ahead.
Nailed.
Shocked by what he saw, Toktuolu, struggling to get back into his seat, attempted to take control of the aircraft from Soungus, who along with flight engineer Bursali had still failed to appreciate the gravity of the situation and the dangerous predicament they had created for themselves and all those on board. Toktuolu simultaneously applied full power and, grabbing the control yoke in front of him, desperately attempted to arrest the aircraft's rate of descent, but without success. As the aircraft's GPWS screamed out its warning of the rapidly approaching terrain, the residents of Isparta below heard what they described as a huge explosion as 452 passed overhead at very low level and struck the hillside at Karatipe, just to the south of the city, in a desperate effort to climb away. The impact, which occurred 100 kilometres or approximately 62 miles north of the actual landing runway, was unsurvivable, completely destroying the aircraft and taking the lives of all 157 souls on board. To this date, the deadliest aircraft accident to have occurred on Turkish soil. But in truth, the story of Turkish 452 raised more questions than provided answers. Why had Captain Toktuolu been absent from the flight deck for such a protracted period of time, particularly given the relatively short sector length to Antalya? How had First Officer Soungus, with his level of experience, failed to cross-check his position and recognise that what he was observing was nothing more than an optical illusion? How had he obviously convinced the flight engineer that his intended course of action was correct, and given the apparent speed with which the decision was made, had there been any discussion between the two? How had the descent progressed to such a low altitude, in good visibility, without any of those seated in the cockpit realising that there was in fact no runway ahead of them at all. Had there been an element of arrogance in Sungus's response to ATC, which suggested it unlikely that he was the type of individual to readily examine his own performance or be receptive to the input of others? And finally, in light of the captain's absence, was this now a closed cockpit environment where tunnel vision, fixation and continuation bias had sealed the fate of all those on board? Regrettably, it's unlikely we will ever know for sure. Such is the bizarre story of Turkish 452, lost on the night of September 19th, 1976.